Hello everyone, welcome to the second lecture of the course. In the last class, we tried to understand what could be likely consequence of ongoing energy use in the form of fossil fuels by human, how it could likely impact in serious rise in the CO2 emissions which could have serious environmental impacts. So we'll continue the similar discussion in this class as well. But suppose let us try to have another purview in which let us assume if the CO2 concentration is rising, let it rise. We are able to manage it somehow, maybe through carbon capture, carbon sequestration or some other avenues. Carbon rise or carbon emissions is not much of a concern for us as a society. Are there some other reasons for which we should be shifting to another economy in the form of hydrogen economy and its derivatives? Because there could be some other challenges from the fossil fuels. And this is going to be the discussion for today's class. We'll try to understand what are the other challenges that we face in India which might propel us to going towards other economies in the form of hydrogen economy. So if I talk about the objective of today's class, this would basically be to become familiar with the prevalence of fossil fuels. We would also like to familiarize ourselves with the associated impacts apart from the CO2 emissions that can come along with the use of fossil fuels. So let us try to have a glimpse of the history of the planet Earth. So the planet Earth is envisioned to be around 4.5 billion years old, and then this Earth has been dominated by different kinds of species over the time. What is normally understood is that a good amount of species or those animals or plants that formed the major fauna and flora millions of years back got buried under the earth, and these fauna and flora, because of the extreme weather conditions, turned out into different fossil fuels, and we discovered these fossil fuels maybe 2 to 3 centuries back, and then we have been using these fossil fuels. So the earth as such has been 4.5 billion years old. Then there were a lot of animals which are roaming on the planet Earth, and then we as a humans have been dominating the earth for quite some time. And I would also like to add some data to this. So with this, we also need to understand when was the earliest known use of fossil fuels. So if you go with the popular literature, it is suggested that there is a historical notification of like 347 CE being the year when humans were extracting oil. Some people suggest this was in China, some suggest that was in India, but that was the likely event from which like oil was found to be there. But there was a scattered use of this oil extraction from the planet Earth. If we talk about the commercialized extraction, this started in much later, roughly in the year 1859, which was basically initiated by the Drake oil well, which is the first modern oil well. And this particularly was in the country of US, the state of Pennsylvania, where there was a mechanized way of extracting oil from the surface of earth and then use it for different applications. If I consider the present, the year 2025, our global oil consumption is roughly of the order of 100 billion barrels per day. So a resource that was discovered quite recently in comparison to the timeline of the earth. So if I see the earth, this is almost 4.5 billion years old. The fossil fuels that we are using now came into existence because of the flora and fauna that existed maybe 400-500 million years back. Then we discovered these resources roughly 2 millennia back, but the use of these resources has been going on for maybe 2 centuries, and within a span of 2 centuries, our daily consumption or the production of these fossil fuels is roughly of the order of 100 billion barrels per day. So if I talk about barrel, this is normally equal to 159 liters. So this is a normal way of donating the volume of oil, because that was dominated by the US, and barrel is a normal use unit of volume in the US. So the point to note here in this slide is that within a very short amount, we have been becoming excessively dominant on these fossil fuels. Another important point to note down is that the production of oil has been going up with a lot of fluctuations. So, in the figure in front of you, you see the Drake oil well. Doesn't look like anywhere near the modern oil wells that you would have seen on the different social media, but this is how simple it looked like 200 years back or so. This was the place where the mechanized production of oil started, and the US oil production has been increasing ever since. So, if I talk about the US oil production, it has been steadily rising since the discovery of oil in their country, and only to be beaming somewhere in the like 20-30 years back, but again it has been seriously rising. The consumption as such has been going great. So, people have always been worried that someday, because oil, coal and natural gas are a finite resource, there could be a massive upheaval because someday this is going to end. It is not a perpetual resource, it is not an infinite resource. Someday we are going to run out of it. And for specifically this reason, a lot of studies have been commissioned. And one of the first studies that was commissioned to overlook on this aspect was called the Hubbard's report, that came up in the year 1956. So, this is basically led by a scientist called M. King Hubbard, who was working with the American Petroleum Institute, and he, with the use of simple tools, predicted that the US oil peak is likely to occur in the year 1965 to 1970. And in fact, if you see the actual data, this is the time when an oil peak in US did occur. But again, because of the limitation of knowledge at that time, things have been going in a different way in the later years. But he could predict very nicely that there is going to be an oil peak in the US roughly in the years 1965 and 1970. Further, 20 years back, US also commissioned a major report which was commissioned by the US Department of Energy, and it was in the year 2005 to 7, and it goes by the name as Hirsch report. So, these reports are available in the public domain, and if you guys are interested, you can have a copy of these reports and go through some of their conclusions. But one of the major conclusions that this report gave was that the world oil peaking is to happen. There is going to be a day when we are going to use a peak we are going to see a peak in the oil production and consumption. This peaking, whenever it happens, can cause economists dearly, which means there is going to be a serious consequence the day people are going to realize that the oil is soon going to turn out. The transportation sector is going to be the worst hit. And finally, the mitigation efforts will run for decades. In essence, this is going to be a unique change which the world has not experienced in the past. So, this was something that was predicted 15 years or 20 years back, and the world took it seriously, and this is one of the reasons that there have been continuous efforts to avoid this oil peak and to make the transition smoother than it is, and not to cause any major upheavals. So, if I see the oil production as such, we have been hearing about oil peaking for many years. I have been hearing about something from my school days that the oil peak is going to end one day. But if I see or the past data, the oil peak has always been delayed. There has been a prediction that oil is going to peak in maybe in 2005, 2010, 2020, maybe 2025. But as such, there has never been a day which people would say the oil consumption has peaked, and there are reasons for that. So now let us try to understand a finite resource, the consumption of which has to peak someday, why it's not peaking. So that could be understood with the help of an example. So this is the former Saudi Arabian Minister of Oil, and he says the Stone Age didn't end because for the lack of stones, and the oil age would not end before the oil runs out. We can understand this phenomena with the help of a diagram which is called the McKelvey diagram. What this diagram does is it basically divides the total oil resources in the form of reserves and resources. So what you have in this diagram on the x-axis is the probability with which I can extract an oil resource. So if you are more towards the origin or the left hand side, it's more probable that you are going to extract the oil. The oil is there with more and more probability. On the y-axis, I have the economics of the extracting that oil. The higher on the y-axis you are, the more economic it is going to be to extract that oil and make profit out of it. And based upon these two parameters, we have divided the total oil resources on the planet Earth between reserves and resources. When I say reserves, I am basically saying that these are the oil reserves which have been quantified to a good extent. I know this amount of oil or crude oil is present, and I can also extract that economically. But beyond this, there are also a huge amount of resources which are either unknown to us or which might not be economical at the present moment because of non-existence of technology, or it might be not a profit-making business that people are putting money into it. What has been happening over the past many decades is a lot of these resources are getting converted into reserves. This is happening because of the finding of new oil discoveries. This happened quite a lot in the last century, but with time, as we are progressing, fewer and fewer discoveries are being made because we have tried to dominate much of the earth. Plus, along with the advancement of technology, many of the resources which were earlier not economical to get extracted are now becoming economical. So what is happening is continuously these reserves are being increasing because of the conversion of these resources into reserves. And this is one of the major reasons why we have not seen an oil peak so far. But that does not mean that there is going to be no oil peak, because as such, the oil reserves or reserves of coal or natural gas or all the fossil fuels combined together are finite on the planet Earth. Someday there has to be a peak and there has to be a reduction. Whenever that occurs, there are going to be likely economic consequences. We can also try to understand this case with the help of a simple example. Let us take a hypothetical case in which we have a finite resource of having capacity of maybe 4 lakh units. You can do this calculation in simple Excel or any other spreadsheet software tool. I have done this calculation in Excel, and you can try at your own convenience as well. So let us assume there is a finite resource for which the amount available is 4 lakh units. Then let us start with the consumption of that fuel. Let's start from the influx of the industrial revolution in the year 1750, and I am using 10 units of this resource every single year till the year 1850. From 1850, I am using 20 units of this resource till the year 1900. From the year 1900 to 1950, I am using 30 units, and from the 1950, I am basically doubling the amount of the consumption every 2 years. So this is basically very nicely replicating how I have been using crude in the past 200 odd years or so. I started with the influx of the industrial revolution, year 1975. The initial production and consumption were quite less, maybe 10 units a year for 100 years or so. Then 20 units for the next 50 years, 30 units for next 50 years, and then there has been an exponential rise in the consumption of this oil. So if I plot this in Excel, I would get a output like this, wherein on the x-axis I have the years starting from the year 1750, and on the y-axis are the units of this resource. So the cumulative unit, we start at 4 lakh units which were there in the year 1750, and slowly I have been utilizing this resource. And if we continue with the consumption of this resource, Probably I am going to end up with this reserves in the next 70 years or so. So you see, as I approach the year 2100, there is an exponential rise in the consumption, and then similarly there is a drastic reduction in the reserve that is going to happen. So if I was to be a layman, I would hear things like the total consumption is minimal in the first 200 years. I don't hear anything of much of an happening. For the first 200 years, which is basically starting from the 1750s till the 1950, we see hardly a king in the reserves, hardly any use. Then the most significant dip in the reserves as well as the increase in the consumption is going to occur in the last 20 years. Further, you can see or you can hear things like when you are towards the end of the oil, say you are in the year 2050 and there is a person who comes to say, which is just 20 years before the depletion of this resource, that we have consumed roughly half of this oil in the last 200 years. So I can assume that the oil is going to continue for another 200 years. But if you see the calculation for yourself, that's not a very healthy argument. The oil reserves might end up in the next 20 years or so. So this is the point that I'm trying to make. The span of time that we are currently in, the rise in the consumption of energy is exponential, which also entails there is going to be exponential decay in the reserves that we have. So the fossil fuels that we have might end up much sooner than we expect them to end. Another thing we also want to understand, how do we determine the price of these fossil fuels? We have been using fossil fuels and their derivatives like petrol and diesel in our vehicles for quite some time. So if you remember your childhood, the price of petrol or diesel that you used to pay in your childhood was somewhat lesser than you are paying currently. And if you are in an advanced age, you would see there has been a drastic rise. So if I talk about the global crude price in dollars per barrel, this is how the price has been changing over the years. So what you have on the x-axis is the years, and what you have in the y-axis is the price of crude in terms of dollars per barrel. You would see there has been an increase and decrease in the price throughout the history. So one might wonder, why is this fluctuations happening? Of course, there could be decline in production sometimes, but why are these fluctuations? So one very pertinent reason is that we as a country in India have no control over these price fluctuations. We have to pay whatever the price is decided by the global community. But why at all these price fluctuations happening in the first point? Many of you would have guessed it right. These price fluctuations are basically correlated to many of the global events. Suppose there is some kind of unrest happening in the Middle East, the prices are going to change. There is some war going up in between Europe, the prices are going to rise up. And there is some kind of another economic sanctions by one of the economic superpowers on another country, the prices are going to fluctuate. Some of these political events and their likely effect on the price of crude have been listed in the slide in front of you. And you would find that India as a country has very little or almost no role to play in any of these events. We have been subjected to these high or low prices irrespective whether we are a part of that global event and or not. So this is again a very big detrimental effect of the use of the fossil fuels. We are dependent on a select few nations for meeting our energy requirements, and any event anywhere in the world could have a very huge consequence on the price that we are going to pay for that fuel. If there is going to be an increase in the fuel prices, the electricity price go up, the transportation price go up, the eatables price go up. It affects our pockets dearly. So this is one of the things that India would want to decouple its dominance in the form of energy on other nations. We would want to be independent as far as our energy needs are concerned, and hydrogen economy provides one such avenue, wherein we would want to produce all the energy needs in a self-sufficient way. We want to minimize our dependence as far as possible on the foreign nations. Another interesting aspect that we see in this graph is majority of the rise, or whenever there have been rise in the price of crude, it is also marked by a decline. Why would that happen? Let us try to understand with the help of simple economic principles. So if we go or try to understand how the market price is determined in a free economy, we can understand this with the help of simple graph, wherein on the x-axis I can have the quantity demanded or supplied for any product, and on the y-axis I would have the price. Now I would normally come across two different kinds of phenomena. The first one is called the demand curve, which goes in an inverse fashion. This basically means the higher the price of a commodity, the lower is the quantity demanded in the market. If something is very expensive, the demand for that particular product in the market is going to go down. So this is why we have an inverse relationship between price and the quantity demanded. And this is what I called the demand curve. Similarly, we also have a supply curve which goes in the opposite fashion. Why opposite? Because if corporate feels that there is a huge amount of profit that could be made in a product, which means the price of a product is going up, the supply for that particular product is also going to increase in the market, and this is what I called the supply curve. Whenever people feel that this is a particular product that can fetch us a good value in the market, the supply for that product is going to increase. The intersection of these two curves is basically going to determine the market price, and this is what is called the market equilibrium. So the market price of any commodity in a free economy is basically determined by the interaction of the supply curve and the demand curve, and this is true for even for the price of crude. Now suppose there is a somewhat of an unrest in some of the countries, maybe in the Middle East, because of which the supply of oil is prohibited, and because of which the supply curve shifts towards the left. Now suppose there is a political unrest that is happening, the supply is disturbed and the supply curve shifts to the left. So if the earlier price, the market equilibrium price was P, now the price of crude would be P high. Now since their price has increased, new market players would want to come in. Might be there are some shale oil producers in the US which were earlier not possibly producing oil at much of a profit, but now they feel that since the market price of crude is higher, they can generate profit out of the production of shale gas, they jump in the market. Because of which there is an increase in the oil that is available in the market, and eventually what is going to happen, the price is going to shift to a low level, which is called the PL. So these are some of the economic phenomena which are going to determine the market price of crude. They are going to be increase and decrease, and because we are not a major producer of energy in India, we are going to have very little control over these market fluctuations. Further, let us go a step further. If we also try to understand the price of crude, how is the price of this petrol and diesel that we are using in our vehicles determined? So if we take about a generic price of fuel, and this is the case for the US, but it's not very different for India as well. If in case we are talking about diesel or gasoline, which is petrol, roughly 40 to 50% of the cost is attributed to the extraction of crude oil. Then around 20% goes towards the refining. Another 20% goes towards distribution because of the tankers and the storage. And finally, we have somewhat of a taxes imposed on that. So this is how the normal price of petrol or diesel that we fill up the tanks of vehicles look like. This is how the distribution looks like. But if we also try to compare this with how these fuels came up in the first place, let us try to have a look. If we talk about petrol, there were many aquatic plants and aquatic life which used to freely roam on the oceans. But with time, they were buried under the earth. Slowly and slowly, the layers increased. And because the intense conditions, which is high pressure, temperatures, anaerobic conditions in the absence of oxygen, and because of degradation of millions of years, this resource turned out to be the tapped oil. And something similar happened in the case of coal as well, wherein these plants which were there, but slowly they were buried under the different layers of earth, and because of again the intense conditions, this was turned into coal, which we are utilizing for a variety of purposes today. So what led to the production of these resources was intense conditions in terms of heat and pressure, anaerobic conditions in the form of absence of oxygen, and millions of years. Now, if we see the price of petrol and diesel that we pay, we are not attributing anything for these conditions that led to the formation of these fossil fuels in the first place. We are just paying for the extraction of these fossil fuels. We are taking the formation of these fossil fuels for granted. Even today, if we want, we can use processes like hydrothermal liquefaction and convert different grades of biomass into crude and different grades of crude. But the energy input that goes into these processes is huge. That makes them uneconomical. It's not that we cannot produce crude, now we can, but it's not just economical. So what we have been doing is that we have been taking these resources for granted, and this might not be good for the future of our society. Further, we also need to understand an interesting relationship that goes up with the prosperity of the society. So if we look at the different society globally in terms of energy use and the GDP, this is how they can be represented. There's an interesting infographic for all of you. What we have on the x-axis is the GDP per capita on a per person basis, and what I have on the y-axis is the energy use in the form of tons of oil equivalent per capita again. The different countries are represented by different circles. The diameter of the circle basically represents the population of that country, and the color of the circle represents which continent they are a part of. What we see, the majority of the prosperous countries like the US, Canada, Australia, which tend to have a very high GDP, also tend to have a very huge energy consumption. If I talk about us, we in India are somewhere here. So the energy consumption is almost half or less than half of the world average, and so goes with the GDP level as well. Majority of the people in our country are not living a very affluent lifestyle, and it's an aspiration for most of the citizens of the country that they would want to go at least to the world average, if not to the developed nation status. And this would also entail a good amount of energy use, because we see that the GDP per capita and the energy use are very nicely correlated. If you are living a very comfortable life, it also entails there is a very high energy use that is coming into place. So this is something we need to be worried about, and this is also an impetus for us, because we are going to increase our energy consumption drastically. We have to make our decisions. Do we need to be even more dependent upon foreign nations over which we have no control over, or should we go up for an energy production pathway over which could be indigenous, which we can decide for our own and which we can change for our own. And this is a great impetus for India towards move towards something called as hydrogen economy. Now, but why hydrogen? So here I've tried to list in some of the points that might be of interest. Now, the fossil fuels are going to deplete at some point. It may be in a very less time or a very long time, but they're going to deplete, and we need to find an alternate for it. One such alternate is the hydrogen. But some of you might be of the view that we don't have any hydrogen infrastructure, there are no filling stations, there is hardly any electrolyzers or fuel cells in place. How are we going to do it? We need to remember, almost 100 years back, there were no roads, there was no oil infrastructure, there were no motor companies. Everything developed. So there was a need in the human society to fulfill the energy needs, and the technologies developed. And something similar can happen with the case of hydrogen as well. And this is something we'll be discussing in the future classes as well. Although some of the people might feel that hydrogen might just come up to be a hype which is going to burst up in a couple of years, we're trying to justify why hydrogen could be more than a hype, what are the promises that hydrogen places in front of us, and what could be likely pathways for achieving it. With this, we take a break for the current class. Thank you.